when it comes to language learning, the golden rule of language learning, the most important thing is to get things wrong, to make mistakes. And that is the first rule. Let me explain to you why. See, when we know languages, we know a whole collection of sounds and a whole collection of structures, which combined make what I like to call, and for the purpose of this presentation, our language database. And our language database will contain all the sounds and structures that we know. However, there's a whole family of sounds and structures that are beyond our database. And for us to be able to embark on those and to be able to explore those, there's nothing within our database, nothing within our knowledge that will tell us when we're getting these structures right. Nothing to tell us when that sound is precise. Let's say we're going to explore this one specific sound. There is nothing in our database. When we're saying it, we could say it perfectly, but in our minds, it will sound like a mistake. So you know that queasy feeling that we feel, that insecure thing when we feel like we're doing something wrong? That is the trigger that you need to look for, because that is a signal that tells you that you're going beyond your database and that you're allowing yourself to explore the realm of a new language. Let me show you how this works in practice. So let's say we're going to go and learn the word door in Spanish. So the word door in Spanish is puerta. So for puerta, we've got a few sounds that exist in English. So the pu, e, and the ta. However, when it comes to the R, that sound is not in our database. The rrr, the rolled R does not exist in the English sound database. And it's a little bit on the outside. So if we allowed ourselves to bridge through our database and to really break through and to make the mistake, we could make sounds like the rrr. But instead, what sometimes happens is that we get the closest relative of it that is within the database, and that is the R sound. And that R sound makes something that sounds like puerta, which doesn't mean a thing in Spanish. It actually doesn't sound too charming, and it doesn't tell you too much. So for the first technique, allow yourself to make that mistake so that sounds like puerta can come out.
Since there's no way to learn English at that time, there's no teachers in our city who can teach people to speak English. So I listened to the BBC and Voice of America. And there, every evening, 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, I open my video. From the first Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I listen to the VOA. The first book I heard about is the Adventure of Tom Sawyer.
Like when learning languages, it's really important that you are interested in any aspect of the language, and language goes hand in hand with culture, people, countries. So let's say you want to learn Russian, but you're not interested in Russian culture. You're not interested in Russia itself and its people. So there's like really no motivation and interest. This is like the base, I think, to learn language and to grow in your learning and really succeed. One good example is that some people have like a really hard time learning languages at school. A lot of people come up to me and say like, I've been learning German for like 7 years. You can't even say like, hey, how are you? Like nothing. They forget everything they learn basically. And everybody that I've met told me this. This is the most common case in language learning at school. When you're like forced or like someone imposes it to you, you're not really like interested and your motivation is not really up. So there's like no point basically in learning because you won't retain what you learn. So that's basically what happens, and it will be double as hard for you to learn. Like for me, let's say when I was learning languages at school, almost every language like I now speak, I started learning at school. But I was always very interested in the languages I chose because I got to choose the languages I learned. So I was very interested, and so from that interest came my motivation to learn and learn and learn more and keep going. Like I was like, I'm in school, so I get it for free. So let me take the advantage to get a free class of language and really profit from that. So I was really motivated to keep going, to learn more and just get to know the culture in general, the people, and inform myself about the country, because I was really passionate about this. So this is what goes hand in hand. Always for me, it was always together, language and culture. I couldn't just begin learning, for example, Spanish without getting to know the Spanish culture and the music and its people and everything. And the more I got to know the culture, the more I loved the language and the more I loved learning it, actually.
Languages, material versus method. I, like many people, came to the conclusion that I was terrible at languages. I suffered through Spanish for junior high, first year of high school, and the sum total of my knowledge was pretty much "Donde está el baño?" And I wouldn't even catch the response. Sad state of affairs. Then I transferred to a different school, sophomore year, and I had a choice of other languages. And most of my friends were taking Japanese, so I thought, why not punish myself? I'll do Japanese. 6 months later, I had the chance to go to Japan. And my teachers assured me, they said, don't worry, you'll have Japanese language classes every day to help you cope. It'd be an amazing experience. My first overseas experience, in fact. So my parents encouraged me to do it. I left. I arrived in Tokyo, amazing. Couldn't believe I was on the other side of the world. Met my host family. Things went quite well, I think, all things considered. My first evening, before my first day of school, I said to my mother very politely, please wake me up at 8 a.m. So, 8時に起こしてください. But I didn't say 起こしてください. I said 8時に起こしてください. Pretty close. But I said, please rape me at 8 a.m. You've never seen a more confused Japanese woman. And I walked into school, and a teacher came up to me and handed me a piece of paper, and I couldn't read any of it. Hieroglyphics, it could have been, because it was kanji, so Chinese characters adapted into the Japanese language. I asked him what this said, and he goes, okay. World history, calculus, 構文, traditional Japanese, and so on. And it came to me in waves. There had been something lost in translation. The Japanese classes were not Japanese instruction classes per se. They were the normal high school curriculum for Japanese students. The other 4,999 students in the school who were Japanese, besides the American. And that's pretty much my response. And that set me on this panic-driven search for the perfect language method. I tried everything. I went to Kinokuniya. I tried every possible book, every possible CD. Nothing worked until I found this. This is the Joyo Kanji Hyo. This is a tablet, rather, or a poster of the 1,945 common use characters as determined by the Ministry of Education in 1981. Many of the publications in Japan limit themselves to these characters to facilitate literacy. Some are required to. And this became my holy grail, my Rosetta Stone. And as soon as I focused on this material, I took off. And I ended up being able to read Asahi Shimbun, Asahi newspaper, about 6 months later, so a total of 11 months later, and went from Japanese 1 to Japanese 6. Ended up doing translation work at age 16 when I returned to the US. And have continued to apply this material over method approach to close to a dozen languages now. Someone who was terrible at languages, and at any given time, speak, read, and write 5 or 6. And this brings us to the point, which is, it's oftentimes what you do, not how you do it, that is the determining factor. This is the difference between being effective, doing the right things, and being efficient, doing things well, whether or not they're important. And you can also do this with grammar. I came up with these 6 sentences after much experimentation. Having a native speaker allow you to deconstruct their grammar by translating these sentences into past, present, future. We'll show you subject, object, verb, placement of indirect, direct objects, gender, and so forth. From that point, you can then, if you want to acquire multiple languages, alternate them so there's no interference. We can talk about that if anyone's interested. And now, I love languages.
And my conclusion, my observation from this is that any adult can learn a second language to fluency inside 6 months. Now, when I say this, most people think I'm crazy. This is not possible. So let me remind everybody of the history of human progress. It's all about expanding our limits. In 1950, everybody believed that running 1 mile in 4 minutes was impossible. And then Roger Bannister did it in 1956, and from there it's got shorter and shorter. 100 years ago, everybody believed that heavy stuff doesn't fly, except it does, and we all know this. How does heavy stuff fly? We reorganize the material using principles that we have learned from observing nature, birds in this case. And today, we've gone even further. So you can fly a car. You can buy one of these for a couple of $100,000 US. We now have cars in the world that fly. And there's a different way to fly, which we learned from squirrels. So all you need to do is copy what a flying squirrel does, build a suit called a wingsuit, and off you go. You can fly like a squirrel. Now, most people, a lot of people, I wouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people think they can't draw. However, there are some key principles, 5 principles that you can apply to learning to draw, and you can actually learn to draw in 5 days. So if you draw like this, you learn these principles for 5 days and apply them, and after 5 days you can draw something like this. Now I know this is true because that was my first drawing, and after 5 days of applying these principles, that was what I was able to do. And I looked at this and I went, wow! So that's how I look like when I'm concentrating so intensely that my brain is exploding. So anybody can learn to draw in 5 days. And in the same way, with the same logic, anybody can learn a second language in 6 months. How? There are 5 principles and 7 actions. There may be a few more, but these are absolutely core. And before I get into those, I just want to talk about 2 myths. I want to dispel 2 myths. The first is that you need talent. Let me tell you about Zoe. Zoe came from Australia, went to Holland, was trying to learn Dutch, struggling extremely a great deal, and finally, people were saying you're completely useless, you're not talented, give up, you're a waste of time, and she was very, very depressed. And then she came across these 5 principles. She moved to Brazil and she applied them, and in 6 months she was fluent in Portuguese. So talent doesn't matter. People also think that immersion in a new country is the way to learn a language, but look around Hong Kong. Look at all the Westerners who've been here for 10 years who don't speak a word of Chinese. Look at all the Chinese living in America, Britain, Australia, Canada, who've been there 10, 20 years, and they don't speak any English. Immersion per se does not work. Why? Because a drowning man cannot learn to swim. When you don't speak a language, you're like a baby, and if you drop yourself into a context which is all adults talking about stuff over your head, you won't learn. So, what are the 5 principles that you need to pay attention to? First, the 4 words: attention, meaning, relevance, and memory. And these interconnect in very, very important ways, especially when you're talking about learning. Come with me on a journey through a forest. You go on a walk through a forest and you see something like this. Little marks on a tree. Maybe you pay attention, maybe you don't. You go another 50 meters and you see this. You should be paying attention. Another 50 meters, if you haven't been paying attention, you see this. And at this point, you're paying attention. And you've just learned that this is important, it's relevant, because it means this, and anything that is related, any information related to your survival is stuff that you're going to pay attention to, and therefore you're going to remember it. If it's related to your own personal goals, then you're going to pay attention to it. If it's relevant, you're going to remember it. So the first rule, first principle for learning a language is focus on language content that is relevant to you, which brings us to tools. We master tools by using tools, and we learn tools the fastest when they're relevant to us. So let me share a story. A keyboard is a tool. Typing Chinese a certain way, there are methods for this. That's a tool. I had a colleague many years ago who went to night school Tuesday night, Thursday night, 2 hours each time, practicing at home. She spent 9 months and she did not learn to type Chinese. And one night we had a crisis. We had 48 hours to deliver a training manual in Chinese. And she got the job, and I can guarantee you in 48 hours she learned to type Chinese because it was relevant, it was meaningful, it was important. She was using a tool to create value. So the second principle for learning a language is to use your language as a tool to communicate right from day one, as a kid does. When I first arrived in China, didn't speak a word of Chinese, and on my second week I got to take a train ride overnight. I spent 8 hours sitting in the dining car talking to one of the guards on the train. He took an interest in me for some reason. And We just chatted all night in Chinese, and he was drawing pictures and making movements with his hands and facial expressions, and piece by piece by piece, I understood more and more. But what was really cool was 2 weeks later, when people were talking Chinese around me, I was understanding some of this, and I hadn't even made any effort to learn that. What had happened, I'd absorbed it that night on the train, which brings us to the third principle. When you first understand the message, then you will acquire the language unconsciously. And this is really, really well documented now. It's something called comprehensible input. There's 20 or 30 years of research on this. Stephen Krashen, a leader in the field, has published all sorts of these different studies. And this is just from one of them. The purple bars show the scores on different tests for language. The green and the purple people were people who had learned by grammar and formal study. The green ones are the ones who learned by comprehensible input. So, comprehension works. Comprehension is key. And language learning is not about accumulating lots of knowledge. In many, many ways, it's about physiological training. A woman I know from Taiwan did great in English at school. She got A grades all the way through, went through college, A grades, went to the US and found she couldn't understand what people were saying. And people started asking her, "Are you deaf?" And she was English deaf. Because we have filters in our brain that filter in the sounds that we are familiar with, and they filter out the sounds of languages that we're not. And if you can't hear it, you won't understand it. If you can't understand it, you're not going to learn it. So you actually have to be able to hear these sounds. And there are ways to do that, but it's physiological training. Speaking takes muscle. You've got 43 muscles in your face. You have to coordinate those in a way that you make sounds that other people will understand. If you've ever done a new sport for a couple of days and you know how your body feels, hurts, if your face is hurting, you're doing it right. And the final principle is state, psychophysiological state. If you're sad, angry, worried, upset, you're not going to learn, period. If you're happy, relaxed, in an alpha brain state, curious, you're going to learn really quickly. And very specifically, you need to be tolerant of ambiguity. If you're one of those people who needs to understand 100% every word you're hearing, you will go nuts because you'll be incredibly upset all the time because you're not perfect.